The Kth ambassador called humanity prey. On a Tuesday, Mara Vash heard it through a translation earpiece she had borrowed from the diplomatic pool because hers had short out on the shuttle, and she heard it 3 seconds after everyone else in the chamber heard it, which meant she was the last person in the room to react, which meant she was also the only person in the room who did not react at all. She was too busy watching her pen roll across the floor. It had slipped off the edge of the table when the Kth ambassador's voice hit register that vibrated through the chamber floor, and now it was rolling slowly toward the base of the ambassador's chair, which was not a chair so much as a raised platform designed to make its occupant look larger than everything else in the room, which in the Kth ambassador's case was not something that required any additional engineering. The ambassador was 7 ft tall, scales the color of deep water, bioluminescent, patterns running along the jaw and throat, currently lit in what Mara had been briefed 3 months ago in a document she had read on a plane while eating a sandwich, was the Kth equivalent of polite contempt. Mara wanted her pen back. The ruling had been read. The Galactic Conclave's classification board had spent apparently 200 years studying humanity from a careful and thoroughly uninvited distance, and had arrived at a 17-volume conclusion. The conclusion was that humans were prey class, soft bodies, no natural armor, no venom, short lifespans by galactic standards, slow to reproduce, emotionally volatile. The board had noted with what the translator rendered as something close to pity that humans had managed to survive long enough to achieve interstellar travel, which was frankly impressive for something that ranked so poorly on every biological threat metric. No species had ever successfully appealed a classification. The Kth ambassador looked down at Mara from the raised platform. She was looking at her pen. It had stopped rolling approximately 4 in from the base of the platform, close enough that retrieving it would require leaning across the ambassador's personal space. The ambassador's personal space currently contained approximately 7 ft of apex classified predator whose bioluminescent threat display was now aimed with focused precision directly at her. She leaned across anyway, got the pen, sat back up, put the pen in her jacket pocket. The chamber was very quiet. The classification board representative, a thin gray being from a species Mara had never encountered before today, cleared whatever it used as a throat. Ambassador Vash, the translator, rendered, the ruling has been delivered. Does the human delegation acknowledge? Mara's earpiece had caught up by now. She had heard the ruling on a 3-second delay quietly while everyone else in the room was watching her retrieve a pen. She processed it. She looked at the board representative. She looked at the 40 Kth warships parked in orbit outside the viewport behind the chamber's far wall, arranged in the kind of formation that was not technically a threat display technically. Sure, okay, she said. The chamber exhaled. The Kth ambassador's bioluminescence shifted, whatever that meant. The board representative filed the acknowledgement, prey class designation, effective immediately, trade route, access reduced to prey class allocation, military sovereignty status, non-applicable, territorial protections, minimal. The language of the ruling was formal and precise, and amounted in plain terms to the galaxy deciding that Humanity was the kind of thing that happened to other things rather than the kind of thing that made things happen. Mara wrote the words "call home" in her notebook. She underlined it once. She did not underline it twice because she had learned a long time ago on a station she did not think about that. When things were bad enough to underline twice, the underlining was already beside the point. The session adjourned. The other delegations filed out. Class species moved in clusters. Mara noticed predator class species moved with the particular ease of animals that had never needed to track exits. She watched this. She had been watching it for 3 months without writing it down anywhere because some observations were more useful when they stayed inside your head. She called home from a communication booth in the corridor, a narrow glass cabinet that smelled like recycled air and someone else's lunch. 14-minute signal delay each way. She gave her report in 28 words, which was all the report there was, and then she ate the granola bar she had been carrying in her coat pocket since morning because the session had run 4 hours past schedule and she had not eaten since the shuttle. It was stale. She ate it anyway. The response came 28 minutes later. She was on her second cup of station coffee, which tasted like hot water that had heard a rumor about coffee and was trying its best. The response was from her direct superior, rooted through 6 government departments, carrying the weight of 8 billion people who did not know this conversation was happening, and it was 11 words. Understood. Hold position. Do not escalate. We are sending the other thing. Mara read it twice. She did not know exactly what the other thing was. She had a reasonable idea. She finished her coffee. The Keith ambassador found her in the corridor before she reached the transit bay, moving quietly for something that large. She noted that was worth noting. You took that well, the translator rendered, though the tone the translation was trying to carry was something closer to you took that in the way small things take bad news when they have no alternative. Mara looked up at the ambassador, at the bioluminescent patterns, at the 40 warships visible through the corridor window, still arranged in there. Technically not a threat display formation. She thought about the pen, the earpiece, the stale granola bar, the 11-word message from home. She thought about what it meant that the galaxy had spent 200 years studying humanity and had arrived confident and thorough at entirely the wrong answer. You know, she said, your people put a lot of work into those 17 volumes. The ambassador waited. You should really read the ones we wrote about you. She walked to the transit bay. She did not look back. She did not need to. The other thing arrived on a civilian transport 3 days later, eating instant noodles from a thermos and wearing a jacket that had survived at least one more decade than it should have. Commander D. Young Park was 51 years old. Retired Special Forces, current director of Xenobiological Threat Assessment, which was a title that sounded like it belonged to someone who filed paperwork in a quiet office somewhere, until you learned that the office had no windows, and the paperwork involved contingency plans for scenarios that most governments preferred to believe were not contingency plans at all. He was unarmed. The Keith intelligence apparatus confirmed this with a full-spectrum scan before he was permitted through the docking corridor. The scan was thorough. The conclusion was clean. The Keith filed it under confirms prey. Class profile. Park found Myra in her quarters. Narrow room with a viewport overlooking the station's outer ring and a desk. Covered in documents she had been annotating in handwriting that had gotten smaller and sharper over the last 72 hours. He pulled up the only chair that was not covered in documents, sat down and offered her the thermos. She took it. The noodles were aggressively mediocre. She ate them anyway. How bad is the classification going to hit us, she asked. Park considered this with the patience of someone who had spent 3 decades being paid to consider things carefully before saying them out loud. Trade restrictions go into effect in 60 days. That cuts access to 40% of the inner transit corridors. Medtech imports from Valhari space get rerouted through Keith tax channels, which raises the cost by about 300%. He paused. Long term it is engineered to take about 30 years to fully land. The Keith are not in a hurry. They think they have time. They always think they have time. Mara handed the thermos back. She looked at the viewport. The station's outer ring was busy. Vessels from a dozen species moving through the docking channels in the unhurried rhythms of commerce. She could identify the Keith vessels by their formation habits, the way even civilian ships maintained attack-ready spacing as a matter of instinct. Tell me about the prey class species, she said. Park set the thermos on the floor. He had clearly been waiting for her to ask this. The 3 prey class species currently holding conclave seats were the Valhari, the Moon, and the Chereth. The Valhari were avian, small, iridescent, navigating the conclave with the careful precision of creatures who had survived by being difficult to catch and easy to overlook. The Moon were aquatic, slow on land, extraordinarily fast in any pressurized corridor, and had been under Keith economic control for 60 years without a single formal acknowledgement that this was what it was. The Chereth no one talked about much anymore. They had 12 seats 2 centuries ago. They had 2 now. Mara looked at him. He looked back. Right, she said. The Keith classification system is not just a taxonomy, Park said. It is a management structure. Prey class means open territory. It means your resources are accessible under resource sharing protocols, which is conclave language for legal acquisition over an agreed timeline. She stood up. The viewport was doing nothing useful for her mood, so she turned away from it. What do we have in place? This was the question he had come to answer. For 40 years, since humanity's first contact signal was intercepted and the conclave's observation protocols were quietly initiated, a small, unfunded, officially non-existent department within the Xenobiological Threat Assessment Office had been running a parallel project. The project had no formal name. The people inside it called it the library, which was either understated or a very particular kind of joke, depending on whether you knew what it contained. The library held biological threat profiles for every conclave species, not military capabilities, not weapons, assessments, biological thresholds, the precise environmental, psychological, and physiological conditions under which each species' decision-making deteriorated, retreated, or failed, what they could not adapt to, what they had no reflex for because they had never needed one. The Keth, for example, had no cultural architecture for sustained uncertainty. Their military history was a sequence of rapid, decisive engagements. They won the first wave. They had always won the first wave. The concept of a conflict that did not resolve quickly was, for the Keth, not a strategy, it was a malfunction. The Velhari representative found Mara the next morning at the edge of the session chamber before the day's proceedings began, small, iridescent, the low station lighting, eyes that moved in careful, sweeping arcs that looked like nervousness and were actually something much older than nervousness. It pressed a thin data chip into her hand with the practiced casualness of a species that had spent centuries learning to pass things without being seen passing them. She read the chip in the bathroom, which was not a dignified location for one of the more significant documents she had ever encountered, but dignity was an adjustable variable. The chip contained a record. Every military engagement the Keth Dominion had initiated in 4 centuries. Every species classified as prey class at the time of engagement, every outcome. The list of species that were no longer present at conclave was longer than the list of species that were. The final entry on the document was recent. The ink, metaphorically speaking, was still wet. It said humans. Mara folded the data chip into her pocket next to the pen she had retrieved from the ambassador's floor 3 days ago. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. 34 years old. Chicago-born, 2 tour on Europa Station. During the years she did not discuss at professional functions, now standing in a bathroom on a space station arguing with a galaxy that had just decided she was the kind of thing that got eaten. She went back to the session chamber. She stopped at the refreshment station, found a Velhari attendant, and asked what the Velhari delegation preferred to drink. The attendant looked at her with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected variable. She waited. Attendant answered. She ordered it had it delivered to the Velhari representative seat and tipped the attendant more than the station suggested gratuity, which was apparently not something that had happened before. Based on the attendant's reaction, small things mattered. Park was across the chamber speaking with a Keth general. He was using his patient voice, the one that sounded like a man explaining something obvious to someone intelligent enough to understand it once they had time to think. The Keth general's bioluminescence was doing something Mara did not have vocabulary for yet. She made a note to ask Park about it later. The session convened. The conclave voted on humanities trade route access. The restriction passed with the margin the Keth needed, and the 3 prey class species voted against it, which changed nothing numerically, but which Mara recorded in her notebook. Every no vote was a data point. Data points became patterns. Patterns became options. She found Park afterward in the corridor, outside the chamber. How bad? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Park's silences were not dramatic, they were functional, the silence of a man sorting through what he was going to say versus what was true. You know how sometimes, he said, you poke something and you think it is finished and it is not finished. It is just waiting. Yes, we are the thing that was waiting. She walked back to her quarters. She did not find this comforting. She found it accurate, which in her experience was frequently worse. The Keth ultimatum arrived at 400. Station time, which was either accidental or a tactic, and with the Keth there was rarely a meaningful difference between those two things. It was a masterpiece of formal language. Clean structure, no ambiguity. 3. Options presented in order of what the Keth considered ascending generosity, each one arriving at the same destination via a different road. Humanity could accept formal prey class integration immediately with a negotiated resource-sharing timeline. Humanity could accept a provisional sovereignty arrangement renewable at Keth discretion, which was the same destination with a nicer door. Or humanity could formally contest the classification and submit to a full conclave arbitration process, which had a historical resolution timeline of 40 years and a historical resolution outcome of 100% in favor of the classifying authority. 3 options. It had always been enough. Mara read the ultimatum at 4:10. She made coffee. She sat at her desk and looked at the viewport where the Keth Warfleet was arranged in orbit with the patience of things that believed they had already won and were simply allowing the paperwork to catch up. She sent one message to Park. He responded in 4 words, "I know. Stand by." She spent the next 36 hours doing paperwork, not symbolic paperwork, real paperwork, the administrative machinery of a diplomatic mission running at full capacity, visa protocols for human researchers on 6 different stations, supply requisitions for the missions, medical bay, a 3-page formal complaint to the conclave facilities office about the chair heights in the main chamber. She filed all of it. She got the chairs approved. On the 37th hour, Earth responded. Not from her department's official channel. The response came from 47 different points simultaneously, across 17 different conclave systems, through channels that were not military, not diplomatic, not anything the Keth threat assessment models had been built to track. They were human workers, researchers, engineers, medical technicians, agricultural advisors, teachers, humans who had spent 40 years being exactly what the prey class designation suggested: harmless, useful, easily overlooked, permitted everywhere because they posed no conceivable threat, and who had in that time become load-bearing, not through infiltration, not through deception, through the simple, relentless human habit of showing up and making themselves useful until the surrounding structure had quietly, organically incorporated them. The Keth ran the numbers. The numbers were wrong. They ran them again. The numbers were still wrong in the same direction with a confidence level that meant the numbers were not wrong, and the problem was with the original model. 11 of the conclave's critical infrastructure systems ran on maintenance protocols developed or significantly modified by human engineers over the past 3 decades. 3 prey class species food security programs were built on agricultural technology that humans had introduced and that no one else had fully replicated yet. The Keth Dominion's own pathogen resistant systems, the medical fleet protocol used across 40 vessels, had been developed by a researcher from Nairobi who had since retired and spent her days growing tomatoes in chorus, bonding with former students. She had never worked for any government. She had worked for a university, then a conclave medical relief organization, then herself. No one had asked her to embed her Methods into Keth Medical. Infrastructure. The Keth Medical team had simply found the methods effective and adopted them, which was in the end the point. You do not need to plan a dependency. You only need to be good enough at enough things for long enough that the dependency grows on its own. The Keth General Esrethva summoned Mara to a formal explanation session, which was the Keth diplomatic term for a meeting at which one party explained something while the other party sat in a room designed to remind them of their size relative to everything else. The room was Keth standard. Ceilings high enough to accommodate 7 ft of apex predator with a comfortable clearance. Chairs built for Keth proportions. Tables at Keth height. Mara sat across from Esrethva and felt the chair under her, which was too tall for her frame, leaving her feet approximately 2 in from the floor, which made her feel 12 years old, which made her feel a very specific and familiar kind of angry that had nothing to do with Esrethva and everything to do with a lifetime of rooms built for something other than what she was. She used that anger. She had learned how it was a known thing, steady, familiar, useful, and she reached for it. The way you reach for a tool you have carried so long it has worn a groove in your hand. Esrethva asked why humanity had not selected one of the 3 options. The bioluminescence along the general's jaw was running in a pattern Mara had not seen before. She catalogued it. We chose a 4th option, she said. Esrethva was still. Mara explained the 4th option in the plainest language she could use, because plain language in a room like this was its own kind of statement. Humanity was not contesting the classification. Humanity was not declaring conflict. Humanity was noting formally, as a matter of record, that removing human personnel and human developed systems from their current positions within conclave infrastructure was the right of every governing body involved, and would be accomplished upon formal request in accordance with standard contract dissolution protocols. The estimated timeline for full withdrawal across all positions in all systems would be approximately 14 months. Esrethva said nothing. Mara continued. During those 14 months, the infrastructure gaps created by that withdrawal would be, of course, the responsibility of the relevant governing bodies to fill. The conclave had access to many capable species. The transition would require some planning. She did not enumerate what some planning meant in practical terms. She did not need to. Esrethva had access to the same numbers the Keth threat assessment models had. Just run and rerun and run again. The general knew what the gaps looked like. The general knew what filling them would require and how long it would take, and what would be exposed in the meantime. The bioluminescence along Esrethva's jaw went dark, all of it completely. Mara had learned from a briefing document she had read on a different shuttle eating a different meal that Keth bioluminescence going fully dark had only one recorded meaning. It meant the animal did not know what to do next. She looked at the general's hands, immense scaled, currently very still. She thought for just a moment about Europa Station, the 18 months that were not in any of her official files, what she had learned there, not in any training module or debrief, but in the specific and thorough way that experience teaches. Things it intends you to keep. The thing that survives is not always the strongest thing in the room. It is the thing that made itself necessary to enough other things that removing it costs more than tolerating it. She did not say this to Esrethva. She had said enough. The silence in the room was doing the work. After a long time, the general spoke. The translator took a moment with the register, and when it rendered the words, there was a note in the audio, something between confusion and recognition that the translator's designers had probably not anticipated needing to encode. "What are you?" Esrethva asked. Myra thought about the pin on the floor, the stale granola bar, the chair that was too tall, the Valhari representative's careful eyes, the researcher in Nairobi growing tomatoes, unknowingly holding a thread that ran through the Keth medical fleet. 8 billion people who had been told in 17 thoroughly researched volumes that they were the kind of thing that other things ate. We are the ones who outlasted everything that ever tried to eat us, she said. She did not raise her voice. Your move. The Keth struck on a Wednesday. Later, analysts would write papers about the timing, whether it was strategic or emotional, whether the Keth command structure had calculated the strike window or simply reached a point at which an apex predator with no language for hesitation defaulted to the only vocabulary it had ever needed. The papers would miss the point, which was that it did not matter. 40 vessels hit 3 human colony worlds. In the first wave, the strikes were clean, fast, and devastating in the way that things are devastating when they are executed by a military that has won every first wave it has ever launched and has therefore built its entire doctrine around the certainty that the first wave is sufficient. Mara heard about it from Park in the station corridor outside the conclave communication center at 600, holding a cup of coffee that was still too hot to drink. She held it anyway. Park's voice was even, not calm. Exactly even, which was a different thing. The voice of a man reporting facts he had been preparing to report for a long time. 3 colony worlds, significant damage, civilian evacuation protocols had initiated within minutes of the first contact, which was not an accident and was not luck. It was the result of a standing order that had been in place for 11 years, quietly, without announcement, drafted by a department that officially did not plan for things like this. Casualties, Mara asked. Lower than the Keth models would have projected, Park said. She drank her coffee. It burned. She drank it anyway. The conclave chamber was loud that morning in the way that bodies of governance get loud when something has happened that everyone expected and no one planned for. The Keth delegation sat in their section with the composed certainty of an authority that had just acted and was waiting for the acknowledgement that always followed action. The prey class delegation sat very still. The neutral class representatives were doing whatever it is that neutral parties do when the neutrality suddenly requires structural load bearing. Myra filed a formal incident report. She requested updated chair specifications for the chambers, secondary meeting rooms. She ate lunch. The Keth second wave launched 14 days later. It hit harder. It was also the wave during which 11 Keth vessels were removed from operational capacity by infrastructure they had not known was capable of resistance because the infrastructure did not look like resistance and had not been classified as a military asset because it was not. 1. It was a power relay network human, maintained, upgraded 18 months ago by an engineer from Bristol named Owen Garrett, who had submitted the upgrade specifications through standard conclave. Infrastructure channels had the work approved, had been paid, and had gone home. The relay network, when Keth vessels moved through the corridor in formation, did something that Owen Garrett's specifications had technically permitted it to do under a very specific set of conditions that the Keth tactical assessment had not modeled, because no one had thought to model a power relay network as a threat variable. Owen Garrett was, at this moment, on Earth in Bristol and had no idea any of this was happening. This was also not an accident. Mara continued doing paperwork. She processed 17 diplomatic communications from conclave member species who were watching the engagement with the careful attention of observers who had not yet decided which direction the situation was going to land. She responded to each one with measured, precise language that neither confirmed nor denied anything that was not already a matter of public record. She called home 14-minute delay. Her mother answered. Her mother did not know the specifics of what Mara did. She knew Mara worked in diplomacy. She knew the job involved a lot of travel and irregular hours. She asked whether Mara was eating. Mara said yes. Her mother said good. They talked for 9 minutes about her mother's garden, which was struggling because of a late frost, and her mother's neighbor's dog, which was not struggling and, in fact, appeared to be thriving in ways that made it something of a local nuisance. Mara found this conversation to be the most useful 14-minute block of her week. She went back to work. Week 6. The Keth pulled back to regroup. In the history of Keth military engagement, which was long and thoroughly documented, there was no recorded instance of a strategic pull back. There were tactical repositionings. There were second wave consolidations. There were pauses between first and second strikes that were not retreats, but were framed as operational breathing room. This was not that. This was something that did not have a Keth word for it, and the absence of the word was doing its own work inside the Keth command structure in ways that Mara could not see, but Park had predicted. The conclave chamber was different that week. The Predator-class delegations moved with slightly less ease. The Prey-class delegations moved with slightly more, not dramatically, not enough for anyone not paying close attention. Mara was paying close attention. She had also, in week 4, quietly invited all 3 Prey-class delegations for working lunch in the station's secondary meeting room, the one with the new chairs, under the agenda item of discussing humanitarian aid protocols for affected conclave regions, which was a real agenda item, and also provided 90 minutes of informal conversation with 3 sets of eyes that had been watching the Keth for a very long time, from angles that no Predator-class species had ever thought to consider. What she learned at that lunch she wrote down in her smallest handwriting, in a notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, in the shorthand she had developed during her time on Europa, because that was a period when writing anything clearly was not something you did if you wanted it to stay private. Week 8. The Keth Logistics Command discovered that portions of their supply chain were not where the supply chain records said they were. Not destroyed, not stolen, rerouted. The rerouting was clean, almost undetectable, the code threading through. The logistics management system was elegant in the specific way that things are elegant when whoever wrote them was not trying to impress anyone, only trying to be effective. The almost was not a mistake. A mistake would have meant discovery by accident. The almost was a choice. Tiny, deliberate tell. A door left slightly ajar so that the Keth logistics command would find it and know with complete certainty that it had been found on purpose, that the discovery was permitted, that someone had been inside the system long enough to leave it impeccably clean and had chosen at the very end to leave one thread visible. The message in that one thread did not need to be written. It was architectural. We were here before you looked. Mara received in week 9 a message notification from a sender she had not heard from in 11 years. The return address was a station she did not say out loud, the name attached to. It was one she had not said out loud in the same 11 years, which was not the same as not having thought about it. But the gap between thinking something and saying it aloud had served her well enough that she had stopped examining the gap. She turned the notification face down on her desk. She processed 6 diplomatic communications. She filed a facilities report. She drafted a response to a conclave committee inquiry regarding humanitarian transit protocols. She turned the notification back over. She read it. She turned it back down. She left it there for 4 hours. Then she picked it up and read it again. She did not respond. Not yet. She put the notification in her pocket. Next to the pen, next to the data chip, next to the notebook. She seemed to be accumulating things in that pocket. Things she was not ready to put down. Week 14. The Keth requested a cessation of hostilities. In 4 centuries of Keth diplomatic and military record, the phrase cessation of hostilities had appeared in a Keth communication in exactly one context, as an offer made by the Keth to a defeated party before the formal terms of that defeat were recorded. It had never, in 4 centuries, appeared in the other direction. Esrethva delivered it in person, in the chamber with the new chairs, which the general had now been in 3 times, and which Mara suspected the general had stopped noticing in terms of the chair heights, which was its own small kind of data point. The bioluminescence was doing something Mara had not seen before on any Keth officer, something that moved in a slow, irregular pattern with no clear communication function. She asked Park about it afterward. Park was quiet for a moment. Uncertainty, he said, it is what uncertainty looks like. They have never been uncertain before. Not in any recorded engagement, no. She sat with that. The conclave chamber was visible from the corridor window. The Prey class delegations were moving through the evening session transition. The Velhari representative, small, iridescent eyes in their careful arc, paused for a moment and looked in her direction. She nodded. The Velhari representative nodded back. Good, Mara said. It came out quieter than she had intended. Park looked at her. She looked at the chamber. It is good, she said in her normal voice. He did not disagree. The negotiations took 9 months. There was a version of that sentence that sounded like a long time, and a version that sounded like no time at all, depending on where you had been standing for the previous 3 decades. From where Mara was standing, 9 months was the exact amount of time it took to rebuild a working framework between a galaxy that had been wrong about something fundamental and a species that was trying to correct it without making the galaxy feel small for having been wrong. That second part was the hard part. She knew it going in. She was not a gentle negotiator. She had never needed to be. Gentleness was a tool she had, along with all the other tools, but it was not the one she reached for first in rooms where the other party had spent centuries winning by force and was now trying to determine whether losing gracefully was something they were capable of. You helped them by being precise. She was precise. The Keth delegation across the table from her was led formally by a diplomatic officer named Vrethko, younger than Esrethva, less bioluminescence, which in the Keth meant either youth or a deliberate dampening. Mara was not sure which it was for the first 3 sessions. By the 4th session, she had decided it was both, and that this was actually useful. Vrethko was listening, you could see it. If you knew what listening looked like, on a face that had not evolved for it. The structural framework of the negotiations was technically simple and practically complex. Humanity's classification status had to be formally reviewed. The trade route restrictions had to be lifted or renegotiated. The 3 colony worlds required formal acknowledgement of damages under conclave recovery protocols, which was language that had never been applied to a prey class species before, because prey class species in the conclave's historical record did not have damages formally acknowledged. They had damages. The distinction was in the word formally, and the word formally was doing enormous work in those sessions. Mara fought for every instance of it. She also argued for 6 weeks about whether the conclave's classification system required structural amendment, the outcome of which was a compromise that satisfied no one entirely and therefore was probably the right answer. The system would not be immediately overhauled, but would be subjected to a formal review process with defined criteria and a binding timeline. Defined criteria and binding timelines were the structural DNA of actual change. Aspiration without criteria was decoration. She had learned this in a policy class before Europa and had had it confirmed by everything since. The review criteria were her real victory. She knew it. Park knew it. The Keth delegation probably knew it by week 7, which was also the week Vrethko stopped dampening the bioluminescence in sessions and just let it run, which Mara read as either comfort or resignation. And either way was fine. The classification hearing itself was the last formal event of the process. The conclave chamber was full. Every delegation seat occupied, every species that held a conclave position was present, because this was, in the formal record, a routine reclassification hearing, and in the informal reality of the room, something that everyone who had been paying attention for the last 9 months knew was not routine at all. The classification board read the findings. Humanity's prey class designation had been issued under criteria that had since been determined to be insufficient for the scope of assessment required. The board noted, in language that was carefully formal and carefully precise, that the original 17 volumes of the Keth assessment had been accurate in their biological measurements and significantly incomplete in their behavioral and adaptive modeling. The board then encountered a problem. The conclave classification system contained 3 designations: predator class, prey class, and neutral class, which applied to non-biological entities and had never been used for a spacefaring species. Humanity's biological profile remained prey class by the existing metrics. Humanity's behavioral and adaptive profile did not fit any existing designation. The board representative, the same gray being who had delivered the original ruling, looked at Mara across the chamber with the expression, or what she had learned to read as the expression of something encountering a category error and choosing honesty over bureaucratic convenience. The existing framework, the representative said through the translator, is insufficient to accurately classify the human species. The chamber was quiet. Mara waited. A new designation will be required. The representative continued. The board proposes the term apex adaptive, defined as a species whose primary survival and development strategy is continuous environmental, behavioral, and technological adaptation across all encountered conditions with no fixed ecological niche. Mara wrote the words in her notebook. She did not underline them. They did not need underlining. The vote was called. It passed not unanimously. 3 predator class delegations abstained, which was a political statement that carried exactly as much weight as Mara had calculated it would carry, which was enough to note and not enough to change. The prey class delegations voted yes. The majority of neutral and predator class delegations voted yes. The resolution carried. Apex adaptive, first designation of its kind. The classification board representative moved to the next item on the formal agenda because there was a next item. Because there was always a next item. And Mara found this deeply satisfying. That the most significant formal moment of her professional life was immediately followed by a routine trade access review, because the universe does not pause for its own milestones. She was filling out her notes when the session adjourned. The Velhari representative found her in the corridor. Small, iridescent eyes in their careful, sweeping arc that had once looked like nervousness and now looked to Mara like exactly what it was, a species that had spent centuries learning to see everything at once, because everything at once had been the threat environment. The representative pressed communication tile into her hand. In its own language, it said something the translator took a moment with and then rendered imperfectly as, "How did you know not to become them?" Mara looked at the tile. She thought about the question. Seriously, not the diplomatic answer. The actual answer, the one she had not said in a formal context or an informal one, the one that lived in the space between Europa and everything after. "We tried," she said, "a few times in a few directions. It kept not working. We kept breaking things, including ourselves. We argued about it for a long time. Some of us are still arguing about it." She paused. "The arguing is actually important. It turns out you need the people who say stop when everyone else is saying go, even when they are annoying, especially then." The Velhari representative was very still. "We would like," it said through the translator, "to be reviewed for reclassification also." Mara looked at the representative for a moment. At the eyes, the careful arc, the centuries of making yourself small, enough to survive a room that was built for something larger. Come find me tomorrow morning, she said. Bring whatever documentation you have on Keth supply chain interactions in your home system over the past 60 years. All of it, not the summarized version. The representative nodded once, the small, precise nod of a species that had learned to confirm things quietly, and moved back into the departing session crowd. Myra stood in the corridor for a moment. After it had gone, the station was busy around her. The usual flow of post-session movement. Delegations heading to communications, to transport, to the informal conversations that happened in corridors and were frequently more consequential than anything that had occurred in the chamber. Several people passed her without any particular acknowledgement. Several others looked at her with the look that she had been receiving for the last week, which was a look she did not have a clean category for, something between reassessment and a question that had not finished forming yet. She was fine with the unfinished questions. Unfinished questions were where the actual work lived. Park found her on the observation deck. An hour later, he was carrying 2 cups of the station coffee that was not good but was consistent, which was the most important quality in a beverage when you were working extended hours on an unfamiliar schedule. He handed her one. She took it. The Keth War fleet was visible from the observation deck, smaller now, 14 vessels rather than 40, repositioned to a holding orbit that was neither threatening nor retreating, which was, Mara reflected, a formation that the Keth would have had no tactical reason to develop or practice until approximately 14 weeks ago. They had learned a new position. Species that learn new positions could learn others. That was worth something. She was not sure yet exactly what it was worth, but the accounting would come. So what happens now? She asked. Park drank his coffee. He had the look he got when he was actually thinking about something rather than preparing to say something, which was a distinction she had learned to read over 9 months of working in close proximity to him in difficult circumstances, which was the fastest way she knew to learn what someone actually was. Same thing that always happens, he said, which is, we survive the next thing. He looked at the fleet, then the thing after that. We build something, we argue about whether we built it right. Half of it falls down, we rebuild it differently. We make the whole situation slightly better or slightly worse, depending on your angle of view and which decade you are standing in. And we argue about that too, constantly, without stopping. It is one of our more reliable features. She looked at the fleet. 40 vessels reduced to 14, not by defeating them in the way that the Keth had always defined defeat, first wave, decisive, clean, but by making the first wave expensive, then uncertain, then unresolvable by any tool the Keth had developed for resolution, and then by offering them something to stand on. Not mercy exactly. Mercy implied power, a symmetry of a different kind, more like recognition, the recognition that a species which had never been uncertain before was experiencing uncertainty for the first time, and that the first time was the worst time, and that what you did with something in its worst moment determined what it became after. She did not know what the Keth were going to become. She had a few hypotheses. She had written them in her notebook in her smallest handwriting. She would revisit them in 6 months and probably be wrong about most of them and right about enough of them to keep going. That was the job. She put her hand in her jacket pocket. The pen, the notebook, the data chip. Still there after all these months. Because she had not found the right moment to take it out, and she had learned to trust her instincts about moments. And the notification. 11 years of not responding, 9 months of carrying it. She took out her communication device. She opened the notification. She read it again. She typed 3 words. She did not look at them for a long time. Then she looked at them. They were the right words, or they were not, but they were the most she had, and she had learned on Europa that the most you have given honestly is worth more than a better version given too late. She sent it. The fleet was still visible through the observation deck viewport. 14 vessels in a formation that did not have a Keth name yet. The galaxy was out there beyond them. Larger than anyone had mapped, more species than the Conclave had catalogued, more conflict than the current framework was built to resolve, and more possibility than any one classification system could contain. It had looked at humanity for 200 years. It had arrived confidently and thoroughly, and with 17 volumes of evidence at the wrong answer. Not because it was stupid, because it was using the wrong question. It had asked, what is this thing? It should have asked, what has this thing survived? The 2 questions look the same from a distance. They are not the same. Myra finished her coffee, cold by now. She had a habit of letting things go cold and finishing them anyway, which was either a personality trait or the result of a decade of working in conditions where hot was a temporary state and finishing things was the only option that mattered. Probably both. She put the cup down on the railing. She looked at the fleet. She looked at the stars past it. Somewhere out there, the Velhari were preparing documentation. The moon were watching. The Cherath, the ones who still had seats, the 2 remaining out of 12, were doing whatever it was that a species did when it had been diminishing for 2 centuries and had just watched something smaller than itself refuse to diminish. Somewhere in Nairobi, a retired researcher was watering her tomatoes, unknowing and unbothered. In Bristol, Owen Garrett was probably working on something new, specifications already drafted, filed through standard channels, approved, paid. In Chicago, Myra's mother was probably arguing with the neighbor's dog. 8 billion people not waiting to be told what they were. Just being it. Just doing the next thing. The galaxy had called them prey. The galaxy had looked at soft bodies and short lifespans and slow reproduction, and had run its models and arrived at its conclusion, and had been so certain, so comprehensively certain that it had not thought to ask what 4 million years of surviving everything actually produced. Not the strongest thing, not the fastest, not the most armored or venomous or perfectly designed for any particular environment. The thing that made itself necessary. The thing that learned from every threat, that tried to end it and kept the lessons and built the next version of itself out of them. The thing that had walked into a galaxy full of predators, classified prey, and made itself load-bearing before anyone thought to check whether it should be allowed. Myra picked up the empty coffee cup. She recycled it in the corridor dispenser on her way back to her quarters. She had reports to file in the morning. New chairs to requisition for the secondary meeting rooms on 2 other stations. A Velhari documentation review to prepare for. A 3-word message she had sent. Waiting somewhere in transit crossing. The distance between 9 months of silence. And whatever came after. The work. Always the work. She went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in 9 months, which was its own kind of victory, and she slept without dreaming, which was another, and in the morning she got up and made coffee and started on the reports. The galaxy had learned a new word. She was going to make sure it kept it.